how on earth did we get here, right? The whole world, well, when I say the whole world, more and more people are starting to realize, but there's a good percentage of the world that genuinely holds the belief that red meat is bad for them. How do we get here?
Well, it is funny, isn't it? Because for the entire history of humanity and prehistory of humanity, we've understood that meat was not only safe but vital for our health and longevity. So the vilification of meat really came in the 1800s, the early 1800s. They thought that if you ate meat, this would give you more lustful feelings, and so there's the puritanical movement, the temperance movement was such that they they argued that people should avoid eating meat, especially women, because if you ate of the flesh, you could think of the flesh, it would give you carnal desires. And this obviously was very, very bad to have sex before marriage. And then sex and lust were sins. And lust was one of the seven deadly sins. So that's how it started. Then later on in the 1800s, more products came out, graham crackers came out because Sylvester Graham promoted a bland plant-based diet in order to suppress sexual urges. And then this was codified into religion by Ellen G. White, who was one of the founding members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who said that she had a vision from God that said that meat was sinful because it caused lust, and lust was a sin. Therefore, it was evil, it was bad, it was a toxin, it was a poison, just like smoking and alcohol and drugs were. And so they espoused a meat-free existence, and so they just um, tried to eat more of a plant-based diet. And so they argued for vegetarianism. And then her protege was a kid named John Harvey Kellogg, who grew up to be Dr. Kellogg, who was an extremely influential and famous doctor in America. And he and his brother founded Kellogg Cereals. And um, this was directly to suppress sexual urges. That's what he said. He said we need to replace meat with plant alternatives to suppress sexual urges and stop masturbation and premarital sex and things like that. And he was actually so obsessed with the no sex side of things that he was actually married for a number of decades. And the stories are to be believed, he never had sex with his wife, and he never actually consummated the marriage. And their children are adopted. And so he was very, very tied up in that. He was a firm believer in that. Since then, they have actually been extremely influential. The nutritional colleges in America and elsewhere, some of these were founded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church members. Lena Cooper founded the American Dietetics and Nutritional Association in the early 1900s. She was a Seventh-day Adventist, and she espoused a plant-based diet. And she wrote one of the first textbooks taught in American nutritional university courses, and it was all plant-based, plant-based, plant-based. It's actually still in circulation. It's actually still being used. Nutritionist Sally Norton got her a degree in nutrition from Cornell University, one of the Ivy League schools in America. And her textbook in the 90s on nutrition was the 44th edition of Lena Cooper's book on nutrition. Again, it was all plant-based, plant-based, plant-based. So they started that out. And they started the nutritional colleges and programs and textbooks to push a plant-based diet. And they've had a lot of influence in the world since then. And then the processed food companies came up because of the Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventist Church still own about 20 different cereal companies. Sanitarium Foods in Australia is the largest cereal producer in Australia, is still owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So they enjoy a tax exemption status because they're a charitable organization, a church organization, and they make Weetabix and things like that, which are just god awful, but they definitely fit that mold, that bland plant-based food. And they so now they have this religious ideology that's backed by a multi-trillion-dollar processed food industry. And so they've been actually able to become very influential, pay for a lot of studies. A lot of nutritional studies are being paid for by the food companies. In fact, the vast majority are. So the processed food industry spends 11 times the amount of money on nutritional research than the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church is actually still very, very much a part of that. They actually are involved in the peer review process because they have medical schools and medical institutions like Loma Linda Medical Center in California, where they actually peer review and approve for publication various papers on medicine and nutritional medicine. So it's very much a rigged game. And they then, obviously they had this giant of an industry that was born out of their original design with Kellogg's and their cereal companies. So now you have this massive industry of plant-based processed foods and this giant sugar industry that came up as a result of that. And so there's this absolutely massive industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry, just the sugar industry. And so when evidence was coming out that heart disease started to go on the rise, it almost didn't exist before the 1900s. And then it became the #1 killer in the 1930s and started going up. And President Eisenhower had a heart attack. And they said, okay, well, we need to get on top of this. And started looking at it. And there were a lot of scientists and researchers that said, hey, this is actually looks like it's to do with sugar and that sugar is causing this. And so the sugar company started putting out opposition research and started paying off doctors and professors and researchers to basically say what they wanted them to say. And there's even correspondence back and forth between these professors and the sugar companies saying, hey, we want you to say it like this to push this angle, and then responding saying, yeah, that's fine, we'll write it that way so it looks that way. So this is a fraud. And this was actually published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2016, actual internal memos from the sugar companies detailing how they paid off 3 Harvard professors to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies to make it look like cholesterol was causing heart disease when it was more likely to be sugar, and then to exonerate sugar and say that it was safe. And one of those professors was named head of the USDA, and he was the one who authored and published the USDA declaration saying that cholesterol was the cause of heart disease and that we should stop eating it. We should stop eating saturated fat and meat as a result of that. So this was a fraud. So it started out with a ideological bent. Then that spawned a processed food industry that was all plant-based, and now they had to protect their investment with sugar and processed garbage. And so they had to pick a scapegoat. And they picked cholesterol. And and so they ran with that. But subsequently, we've had study after study, meta-analysis with only randomized controlled trials. This is how it works, right? You have epidemiology, and that can form a hypothesis, right? It can't actually show cause and effect. It can never show cause and effect. And yet there are no cause and effect studies that show that cholesterol causes heart disease. And so no more we're ever taught in medical school. I was not taught that. We were taught the Framingham study, which is just a correlative study. It can show an association, but association cannot ever prove causation, right? So association doesn't necessarily equal causation, because you have an association between ice cream sales and shark attacks. Does that mean that ice cream sales drive shark attacks and vice versa? No, but you can have a summertime where it's a lot more warm and you want to buy ice cream and you want to go in the water where the sharks are, right? So there's a correlation. That doesn't mean there's a cause and effect relationship. So the only studies that we have that point towards cholesterol and saturated fat as being a problem with heart disease are correlational. The only randomized controlled trials that have ever been done have actually shown the opposite. As you replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat and reduce cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, heart disease rates and heart attacks and strokes and deaths from heart attacks and strokes actually goes up. And so why weren't those taught in medical school? Why aren't those taught to people now? Because they were buried, because they didn't like the result. They didn't like the answer. And so they didn't want people to know about it. And so they didn't want to talk about it. And that's why, and then they didn't go and keep doing studies because they already knew what the answer was going to be. So they just taught correlational studies in medical school. Why are we accepting that? We shouldn't be accepting that. And so people should take a look at that. But because it's just been repeated and repeated and repeated, people do accept it. But if you actually look back, what is this based on? It's based on weak correlational evidence. And a lot of these things have been doctored and altered as well. The Framingham study actually had their information misrepresented as well. And so it actually didn't show a correlation between cholesterol and heart disease. It's not an inverse relationship between cholesterol and heart disease. As you lower cholesterol, death from cardiovascular disease goes up. And so this has just been a fraud from the beginning, and it's being perpetuated because there's trillions of dollars at stake, and so they're trying to protect their investment. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church is actually still very active. They're extremely wealthy, and they are still pushing this religious agenda as well. It's kind of weird, but those are the facts, and people can look them up.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are some correlation studies out there that suggest that, when you increase fiber intake, it proves to be a good thing, right? And the same thing with red meat. There are some studies that show as you increase the amount of meat you eat, it tends to be a bad thing. Now, there's this concept known as healthy user bias, which really discredits these studies, upon a deeper glance. Can you explain to the people at home how they're able to find these alleged causes?
Well, the thing is that again, you have an association. Association is not causation, and so you have to take that for what it is. It's only hypothesis generating. So you say like, okay, well, look, we see this sort of correlation. So I have a hypothesis that there's a cause and effect relationship, but you have to then test that. And so the studies that you're referring to with the healthy user bias is where you have one person that does something that they think is better for their health. They're much more likely to do other things that they think are benefit for their health. So we've been told that fiber is very healthy and eating less meat is very healthy for decades now. And so people that are more likely to eschew meat and eat more fiber and fibrous plants and fruits and vegetables because they believe those there are health benefits from that. They're more likely to do other things that provide health, like exercise, like get outside, like um, uh, you know, eat less junk food, not smoke, and not drink, things like that. So there's a lot of these different confounding factors. Also, the other thing is that these studies are fairly dishonest in and of themselves because they include food items that contain meat but are not exclusively meat. And so they say that that fast food, including the bun and the sugary sauce and all the vegetables and the fries, deep fried in trans fats and seed oils, and the sugary drink, that's meat. That counts as meat, even though that's the least ingredient in that entire equation is meat. They consider that meat. You're eating meat. If you eat less meat, if you eat junk food, you're eating less meat. Okay, but you're also eating less junk food, aren't you? Pizza is considered meat because sometimes there's meat on toppings. So they don't say like, oh, was it a vegetarian pizza? Okay, with like soy cheese or something god awful like that. They don't ask that question. So it's like if you eat pizza, that's meat, and lasagna and sandwiches. What is it? What is the definition of a sandwich? It's something between two pieces of bread, right? That's the definition of a sandwich. And so obviously it's not just meat, but they consider all of that meat. And so then you have healthy user bias and you have dishonest representation of what meat is. And obviously you're going to get a very skewed answer. With fiber as well, people that are eating more fiber are people that are thinking, okay, I should eat more fiber. That's healthy for me. They're going to do other things that are healthy for them as well. But what also are they doing? They're also eating less junk food, less processed food, because processed food notoriously doesn't have fiber in it because it doesn't freeze well. You have to freeze these things and then ship them all over the world, and fiber doesn't freeze very well. And so none of it has fiber, or very little of it has fiber. And so it's if you're eating, it basically what it's telling you is, are you eating more whole food versus junk food? They haven't ever done a study looking at someone who doesn't eat fiber because they're eating a lot of meat that doesn't contain fiber, but it's still a whole food approach, like the Inuit, the Maasai, me, and all the other carnivores around the world. We don't eat fiber because but we're eating a whole food diet, but it just doesn't contain fiber, and we're extremely healthy. We don't have any of these so-called problems that they attribute to meat and or lack of fiber. And so you're comparing apples to oranges. You're saying that, oh, eating more fiber is always good no matter what. No, it's always compared to what. Any economist will always ask you, say, well, what's the difference between how good is this? Well, compared to what? What are you comparing it to? What are you comparing fiber to? Are you comparing it to processed food and garbage? Yeah, it's better. Okay. Comparing it to a whole food meat-based diet that doesn't contain fiber? No, it's not better. You don't need it. Fiber is indigestible. You can't break it down. We don't have the ability to. A bit of your gut bacteria can break some of it down, but it's a very small portion of that. You can't. We cannot. We don't make cellulase. No vertebrate animal makes cellulase. And so it's actually the microbes in herbivores' guts that actually break down and eat the cellulose. And as a byproduct, they produce saturated fat. And then those bacteria die off and they get absorbed as protein. So they're eating fiber, but what they're absorbing is fat and protein. So even when that gets to our gut and our bacteria eats some of it, very small amount of it, it can only account for a very small amount because we have a very short lower intestine and a very short cecum, which is just an appendix. Normally in animals, primates that that eat fibrous plants. That's a big, long, 4-foot long cecum. And that's where fiber packs into and breaks down into fatty acids and protein. So we may get a little breakdown from the fiber, but what does it turn into? It turns into saturated fat, right? And so we're saying that saturated fat is good now. And it's like, oh, you need it because you need these short chain fatty acids and butyrate and things like that, that help feed your enterocytes. Okay, well, why don't you just eat fat then? And you'll be in a state of ketosis and you'll make all these things yourself. Obviously, that's bad though, because fat's bad unless you're somehow getting it from fiber and then it's good. So it's a very mixed up logic, but that's the idea. There's a lot of confounding factors. There's a lot of things that go into it. You can't just say, yeah, fiber is good because there's this associative study that shows that. When you look at the randomized controlled trials, interventional trials, using fiber and introducing fiber and adding fiber tablets and taking them away, they largely find that they do absolutely nothing of benefit. There are some studies and people have come out, oh, look at this meta-analysis and this shows that fiber is great. Well, that's certainly the conclusion, that there's a net benefit when you eat fiber, but then you look at the studies that it includes and it certainly doesn't draw that it certainly doesn't deserve to draw that conclusion. Again, it's comparing processed food eating to unprocessed food eating or standard processed food garbage diet and add a fiber pill and then see, ooh, what's the difference? One of the things that fiber does is it blocks out the absorption of different nutrients, etc., that you may eat. And so if you're eating high octane garbage, then actually reducing the amount of that you absorb is actually probably a good idea. And it can be as much as 30%, according to Dr. Robert Lustig from UCSF, you can reduce the amount of absorption by 30%. So if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, you're eating a lot of sugar, you're eating a lot of garbage, and you're reducing the amount that you absorb by 30%, that's probably a net positive. There are actually a number of diabetes medications that actually work on that exact action. And so they stop you from absorbing, like acarbose. It prevents you from absorbing as many carbohydrates. You have less carbohydrates that go in your body and your blood sugar doesn't go up quite as high. Well, why don't you just eat less carbohydrates? And then you will have even less carbohydrates going into your body and your bloodstream. So that's what fiber does to you. And so some of these things say, oh, well, look, it actually helps improve blood pressure. Okay, well, let me look at the study. And you look at that study and they gave people a fiber tablet and they just ate whatever the hell they ate. And they looked at their blood pressure. And on average, it dropped by like 1.5 points of their systolic blood pressure, right? So if your blood pressure is 170 and you drop that down to 168.5, like that's literally negligible. It's insignificant. You're not in a danger zone and bring you out of a danger zone. It's just, it's background noise. So, and again, how would it do that? You can't break it down. You can't absorb it. You can't gain any nutrition from it. So what is it doing? How is that mechanism? What is the mechanism by which they're lowering your blood pressure? Well, they're probably just reducing the amount of garbage that you're absorbing in your body, and that has some sort of knock-on effect down the road. Well, how about you just stop eating the garbage altogether and only eat what we're biologically adapted and designed for, and you won't have that problem at all. And this is what, thousands, if not millions of people around the world are doing now. And by going back to an ancestrally appropriate diet and proper human diet, and they're coming off their blood pressure medications, they're coming off their diabetes medications, they're coming off their autoimmune medications, they're coming off of all these different sorts of medications and treatments that they've never been able to figure out. We've only been able to treat symptomatically. And, and yet, now they're coming off, they don't need treatment whatsoever. So you cannot look at an associative study and draw any hard conclusions. Now, maybe that's enough for you to influence your life and your behavior, and that's totally fine. And if you find that you have benefits from that, go for it. And if you add fiber into your diet and you find that's a net benefit, lovely. I'm very happy for you. But if you try it and it doesn't do that, and it doesn't add joy and value to your life, well, then it doesn't really matter what a study says because it's not doing much for you.